In this video, I'll demonstrate how to use the custom brushes I created for Rebelle 7. You can download these brushes from my website at aaronrutten.com. All these brushes are sorted into categories, and they can be found in the favorites. Let's start with rendering and soft airbrush. This brush works really well for creating hand-painted gradients. If I use lighter pressure, I will get a less opaque mark, and if I use heavier pressure and build up the stroke, I'll get a stroke that's more opaque. As you can see, I can use this to paint a really nice sky. Grainy Airbrush is very similar, but with the addition of grain. If I open the brush creator and look under grain, here's where I can choose from the various grains that you can express in the brush. And again, lighter pressure gives me a more transparent stroke, heavier pressure gives me a more opaque stroke. The Glazing Airbrush is next. I'll put down some blue paint with this brush, and you can see what makes this brush different is the way that it builds up. It does not build up to a more opaque color as you continue the stroke. It just kind of stays like this thin glaze. But once you lift your pen up, then you can build up the color. Lift my pen up again and build it up more. So I can create these really nice subtle glazes. Use some different colors here, and I don't have to worry about the paint building up too quickly. Next is the Foggy Airbrush. We'll use this on a darker background color. Paint with this brush, and you can see it creates these really nice, lumpy, foggy effects. I could use this to put in some fog or a nebula or clouds. Just kind of build it up like this. Again, lighter pressure gives you a more transparent mark. Next, we'll take a look at Glow Brush. This is another type of airbrush. I'll choose a darker color here and lift my pen several times to build up some strokes. You can see I can get this really nice glowing effect. This type of brush works really well for lights. Let's pick another color here. If you want it to build up slowly, you choose a darker color. If you want it to build up quickly, then you can choose a brighter color. You can even use a smaller brush if you want to highlight edges like so. And the last airbrush is Dynamic Airbrush. This airbrush gives you an interesting effect. When you press down firmly, you get a thinner line. And when you press down lightly, you get a thicker line. That's opposite to how brushes usually work. So what I can do with this is I can very easily sketch and then add some shading, all using the same brush. So I don't have to switch between a sharper, thinner brush and an airbrush. I have one brush that can do it all. I can put in my highlight here using light pressure and then use heavier pressure to make it sharper, and I can get kind of everything in between. Next are some thinner brushes. We'll start with Smooth Pen. This works really well for inking and blocking in big shapes. So if you want something with nice smooth edges, you can put it in like this. Enable lock transparency, and then use something like one of the airbrushes to add shading. I'll disable lock transparency and clear this. With a thinner brush, you can get really nice ink lines. But if you want lines that are smoother, choose Smooth Scratchboard. This has a bit of smoothing, so your line is going to be slowed down just a bit. That means when you draw with it, it'll be slightly less accurate if you're sketching quickly. But if you're drawing slowly, you'll get much smoother curves and straighter lines. You can control the level of smoothing up here in the properties under line smoothing, and you can add more if you like, if you want it to be even smoother. You can reset any of these brushes with the X. The next thin brush is Sketching Pencil. When I draw with this brush upright, I get a thin line, and when I tilt my pen, I get a broader mark that's more transparent, and this allows me to emulate shading with the side of a pencil. So pen is upright, and the pen is tilted, and you can see how I can change the shape of the mark by changing the angle of the pen. Lighter pressure gives you very, very light values, and heavy pressure gives you darker values. I can get everything in between. Next are a collection of textured brushes. We'll start with chalk. Light pressure with chalk gives you a lot of grain. Heavy pressure begins to cover that grain. You could use this to draw with chalk, but this is just a name for the brush. I use this more for its appearance than anything else. So for example, even though this is a chalk brush, it might work really well for drawing foliage. Many of these textured brushes will also utilize paper grain. So for example, if I choose the canvas paper, in addition to that texture, I'm also able to get the grain of the paper. If you don't want the paper texture, then you want to choose white simple. Next is random chalk, which is similar to chalk, but it has a slightly different look. It shares the same behavior where heavier pressure gives you a more opaque stroke, and lighter pressure shows more of the texture. But as you can see, the texture is more random overall. It's also more opaque and sharper. Let's take a look at smooth chalk. Smooth chalk blends together and has a softer appearance, so if I keep going over this, you can see it kind of smudges together as if I'm smudging it with my finger. Still get that nice texture, but lighter pressure is blending. Sponge is another textured brush. I'll paint some strokes with this, and you can see it has a very nice, spongy, random looking dab with a lot of texture. If I use lighter pressure, I can sort of lift the paint, as if this is maybe smudgy or wet. If I make my brush larger, those features will be larger. If I make my brush smaller, those features will be finer. And I can, of course, mix colors together in various ways to get a nice, messy effect. Let's take a look at variable foliage next. As the name implies, this brush works really well for foliage. When I'm pressing hard, I get a very sharp dab like this, but if I press lightly, then I get something that's a bit softer and more splattery looking. So if I combine these two shapes, I get something that looks a lot like foliage. It has a lot of variety to it. I can select a lighter color like this and use lighter pressure to put in my highlights and sort of blend those in. It gives me a really nice effect. Here's variable shape, which is a similar brush. You can use heavy pressure to get sharper edges, or lighter pressure to get something that's more sparse and speckled. So this gives me yet another look for my foliage. As you can see, these leaves are finer, but you're not limited to using this for foliage. You could use it to create a rocky texture like so. Next are a collection of speckled brushes. First is speckle spray. As you can see, I can spray out these speckles. This might work well for painting stars or snow or sand. If I make my brush smaller, then those speckles get finer, and I can get a variety of shapes. Pepper spray is another speckle brush. You'll have to zoom in very closely to be able to see these because they're only a few pixels wide. Let's check out splatter spray. This is yet another spray brush, but this gives you more of a splatter effect. Let's try some other colors here. This is more of a painterly splatter rather than something that you'd use for nature effects. As you can see, if I zoom in, those little blobs aren't very uniform. Let's take a look at cylinder pen next. I'll choose a dark brown color, make some test strokes here. And you can see if I go from heavy to light pressure, I can taper off my strokes like this. And the strokes are sort of hollow on the inside, so that will allow me to get sort of a three-dimensional effect. I don't have to add shadows or highlights on this. They're already included. You could also use this just to dab and make something like scales, or you could make short strokes to do something like a tree bark texture. This could be tentacles, claws, maybe even feathers. And of course you can change this to different colors. Might even work well for leaves. Detail oils is a nice thin brush that you can use if you want more of a painterly effect. So as you can see, if you use light pressure, you can kind of smudge and blend this. The last two brushes in this category are glazing brushes. Let's try glazing hard. This is a glazing brush with a hard edge. So as you can see, I can very slowly and deliberately build up my opacity. If I paint a stroke and I continue painting, it doesn't build up on itself. It's only when I lift my pen up that I begin to build up the color. You could use this with a light or a dark color to build up values like so. And then we have a soft edge version of this brush, which does something similar, but with a softer edge. So as you can see, I can add a nice glazing over everything. And again, I can build up the values by lifting my pen. Next, we'll look at the blenders category. First is the blur brush. I'm going to use this on this background texture here, and you can see that it makes it more blurry. If I press more firmly, I get a stronger blurring, and if I press lightly, I'll get a very subtle blurring. Zoom in so you can see this better here. If I go to this other layer, you can see that I can blur the edge as well, just to soften it a bit. You have to be careful because this can sort of smudge your paint around, and if you have a straight line, it can make the line wobbly. Next is Broken Blender. This blender gives you a paint break effect, where the paint is sort of broken and it only blends in some places and not in others. It gives you this really nice texture. This is meant to be used with some other brushes, which we'll look at later in the palette knives category. But as you can see, I can blend and get a lot of texture. Next is Coarse Oily Blender. If I pull some streaks with this, you can see I get this really nice oily smudgy effect with a very sharp coarse edge. You can also tap to kind of break up the edge. Do little short strokes just to blend it up a bit. Could do curved strokes. And I just get this really nice organic looking blend. Next is Diffuse Blur. This gives me kind of a dry blending effect. If I zoom in here, you can see it mixes all the pixels together. The one problem is, as you can see, it kind of sprays the pixels outward as it's blending. That might mess up the edge of your shape. Lighter pressure gives you a lighter blending, heavier pressure gives you a thicker blending. We'll skip past Finger Blender to Grainy Blender real quick, because this is sort of an alternative to Diffuse Blur. If I paint with this brush, it does not spray pixels out along the edge. As you can see, if I just go straight up and down here, it makes the edge grainy. And if I paint in transparency, you can see it doesn't pull pixels out as far. Now we can take a look at Finger Blender. This dab is shaped like a fingertip. So if I blend with this, it looks a lot like I used my finger to blend. The size of the fingertip is controlled by the size of the brush, so if you want a smaller fingertip, you can add that in. This, of course, can blend to transparency as well. We'll zoom in so you can see that nice fingerprint texture. Let's take a look at Oily Blender. This gives you a nice oily effect, but it also has a bit of impasto, so this is best used on something that already has impasto so that it looks like it's smudging it around. You can use light pressure to kind of softly blend and not add much impasto, or you can use heavy pressure to really plow through the impasto and build it up as you blend. Let's take a look at Smooth Knife. If we use lighter pressure, we can very lightly blend things up. Or if I use heavier pressure, then I get a more oily, broader smudging. I can kind of mix the two together to really blend this paint up. Here's Speckle Blender. As the name implies, it blends with speckles. These speckles are fairly large. You can control the size of them by making your brush larger or smaller. Here is Streaky Blender. This gives me a really streaky blend, so I could use this to pull out fur or grass or something like that. And then last in this category, we have Water Blender. Water Blender gives me a nice wet edge, so it looks like I'm just adding water to the paper and blending it together that way. This is a good brush to use with watercolor and other types of wet media. It does pull paint out sort of far, so you have to watch out for that. Next, we'll take a look at my palette knives. First is Thin Knife. Thin Knife supports pen tilt, so I can tilt my pen in various directions to get different stroke widths and shapes. This brush works really well, in particular for painting waves and water ripples and things like that. You can use light pressure to blend with this brush, and you can blend out all those little wave shapes to make foam and all kinds of nice things. Here's a collection of broken brushes, and no, this doesn't mean that they don't work, it just means that the paint breaks. If I use light pressure, then I can kind of blend and smudge. If I use heavier pressure, then I will get these nice thick strokes. If we look in the visual settings, here's where we can control the thickness of the paint. Now this particular brush is pretty flat, it doesn't have a whole lot of thickness, but we do have Broken Hard, which is much thicker, as you can see. We have Broken Thick, which is even thicker than that. And we have Broken Grainy, which is kind of soft and grainy, but it's meant to be used on top of pre-existing paint. We can change the grain pattern of broken grainy to other grains as well. If I wanted a texture like this, and again, this is meant to be used on top of pre-existing paint. Let's take a look at heavy texture. This gives me a really thick, heavy texture effect. Add some other colors into that, and you can see it has a lot of relief to it. And again, I can control that in the visual settings if I don't want it to be too thick. Mountain knife is next. This is sort of the foundation for painting mountains because it has a nice rough edge. It responds to pen tilt, so I can make nice pointed edges like this. And so what I would do is put in something like this, then use lighter pressure to sort of fade out the bottom and add some texture to it. And then use one of these broken brushes, like Broken Soft, with lock transparency enabled, to go through here and make these nice mountain shapes. So I'm just putting snow on one side of the mountain and not on the other. That makes it look three-dimensional. Let's take a look at Scrape Knife. I'll go ahead and just use this right on top of what I already painted. And if I curve, it really emphasizes the form of the mountain. So I just like to paint on top of stuff that I've already put down just to enhance the texture. Select kind of a background color here and put some of this in, going the opposite direction. And you can see how effective it is. If I disable lock transparency and I paint some strokes, you can see they sort of add and subtract from each other. Once I lift my pen up though, it's going to gradually build up. You might even want to use this for foliage and things like that. Chapter Sharp Knife. Let's take a look at Sharp Knife. This has a really random, interesting shape to it with some texture. Try some other colors here that we can mix into it, and you can see if I use lighter pressure, I can blend with this and get some really interesting results. And last in the palette knives is Smooth Knife. This responds to pen tilt as well, so I can get a thin line, a thick line, and everything in between. I can also use lighter pressure to smudge and blend. If I want to add some other colors into this, I can, and mix them together in a very nice, wet, oily way. And if you wanted just the blender version of this, that's the Smooth Knife Blender, which has the same appearance, but it's strictly a blender. Let's take a look at the Nature category. This is a collection of brushes that work really well for painting landscape elements. Let's start with Cloud Knife. I'll change to a blue canvas. If we paint with this brush, using light pressure, I can get very wispy, thin shapes. Or if I use heavier pressure, I can get big, clumpy, thick shapes. So you can see I can very easily just get a lot of random cloud shapes here. Kind of layer them up like this. This brush reacts to pen tilt, so I can get a thin line or a thick line. So if I want thin clouds like this, I can put them in very easily just by putting in the base and then putting some stuff on top. Let's take a look at Far Evergreens next. This brush sprays out little evergreen trees that are far away. Lighter pressure gives me smaller trees, and heavier pressure gives me larger trees. So what I want to do is use light to heavy pressure, and then I get that sense of perspective. There's another version of this brush that's more variable. So if I put down some trees, you can see they're a little bit more random. There's some skinny trees and wide trees all next to each other, whereas the other ones are more uniform. So you could use this just to add some variety, so you don't have all the same looking trees. Let's take a look at Oily Forest next. This is another brush for painting trees, but you can imagine maybe there's a ridge going right along here, and this has a bunch of trees growing on it. This is maybe more of an impressionistic style. I can use lighter pressure just to kind of fade these out into mist. If I need to go over it multiple times, I can. Make the top a little bit more jagged so it's not so uniform. And I get something that looks like a nice tree line. I can layer it up like so. If I want to add other colors into it, I can do that as well. Then of course, any of these brushes can be toggled between the various modes, so I could simply press V on my keyboard to go to blending mode. If I wanted to blend those two colors together, then I could do that. As I'm blending, I'm still getting that same brush shape or texture. I'll go ahead and reset this brush. Here's a brush called Oily Ripples. Use a blue color for this. And as you can see, I get this really nice rippled effect. If I use a lighter pressure, then I can blend. I could change my color up and paint some really great looking reflections on the water here. If I want to make those water features smaller, I'll go to the brush creator and look under shape and grain. If I go to the texture properties, then here's where I can scale that down a bit. You want to make sure to keep it stretched like this. But as you can see, those features are now smaller. Let's try oily waves. This gives me a similar effect, but I can curve my strokes to make something that's a little more wavy. So maybe this is water that's in the ocean, so the waves are churning it around like this. It also makes sort of a waterfall effect with this brush. And if I want to add in blue colors, I can do that. Gives me a great ocean effect. Next up is tree clusters. I've gone ahead and added some paint in here, and I'm going to turn on lock transparency. Tree clusters works really well if you want to paint trees that are far away. So let's say this is a hill and there's going to be a lot of trees covering it. I can add in little dabs of trees like this. And without having to paint every single tree, I get these nice clusters. I can make my color brighter and add some highlights. And that gives me millions of trees without having to paint each one individually. You'll notice that the color will build up, so you don't want to make your color too bright. You probably want to stick to colors that are more desaturated so they build up slowly. This will help the trees look more three-dimensional. Next up, we have water texture. This brush gives me really nice ripples that I can put on water. Might just want to use a few of these here and there if you're doing a reflection, or if you're painting a waterfall, you can get a great waterfall effect, or if you're doing churning water like this, you can get some great fountain effects. And of course you could switch to blending, and if you want to blend it a little bit, you can get that same texture and smooth it out a bit. The next brush we'll look at is called Fan Evergreen. This brush reacts to pen tilt, so if I change the direction of my pen, then I can get different angles for this dab. If I use light pressure, then I'll get thinner marks. If I use heavier pressure, then I'll get wider, thicker marks. So what I want to do is start with light pressure and gradually increase my pressure and gradually move to the side to get these really nice evergreen trees. I can kind of tilt my pen side to side a little bit too if I want to spread those leaves out a bit more. If I want to add a little bit more detail to those trees, I'll choose Evergreen Form, make my color a bit brighter, and lock the transparency of those layers. Now when I paint, you can see that I get that nice form that I can add to them. Make my color a little bit brighter. And if I want to just add in a few sparse highlights, I can just tap with my pen. This gives me great painterly looking trees. Brambles is the next brush we'll look at. Choose kind of a brambly color here. And you can see I get something that looks maybe like blackberry bushes, just a lot of tangled different plant things. Add a brighter color and add some detail over that, and even brighter. And of course I could switch to a blender and I could kind of mix it together if I need to as well. Or I could choose the erase mode if I overdo it and kind of break it apart to create negative space. Let's try bristly dabs next. Any brush that says dabs you typically want to dab with, but you can also paint strokes to build them up like this. But dabbing tends to work better because then you get these very fine leaf patterns. Make my color brighter and dab on top of that. You can also click with your mouse to create dabs if you want very, very sharp dabs that don't get smudged around too much. As you can see, that works well to create these little highlights. Here's another type of dab brush. This is Bushy dabs. I want to tap firmly and build up some strokes. This is a bit softer of a brush. I can also click with my mouse if I want them to be thicker and sharper. As you can see, I get these bushy effects. Use light pressure to paint on this to add some form to it. Here's a brush called Cloudy. This gives you more of the cumulus style cloud where it's more fluffy and clumpy like this. So heavier pressure is giving me these big thick clumps, and then lighter pressure will blend and give me a flatter stroke. So I can kind of fade out the bottom like this and blend it together a bit if it's a bit too strong. Add another big thick area here, and then blend it a little bit to soften it and make it look more cloudy. Do one more fluffy one over here. Make my brush smaller to make those features smaller. Or I can make my brush bigger to make those features larger. Here's a brush called Clumpy Dab. I'll click with this brush and you can see it does create clumpy dabs. If I add some color to it, you can see those dabs have some thickness to them. You can paint with this brush as well to create dabs. So if you want leaves that already have a bit of texture, this is a good brush for that. And again, I can press V to go to blending if I want to kind of blend it together and soften it a bit. Next is fan highlights. This is another fan style brush where I can change the angle of it just by tilting my pen in different directions. This might work well for painting grass. You want a really impressionistic style. Of course, you could use it for trees if you want foliage. You could even use one of these evergreen brushes to put in your base color, and then use the fan highlights on top of that with a lighter color. Kind of emphasizes that pine needle effect. Here's a brush called Fine Brush. This gives me these nice tree trunk effects where they're a little bit grainy. It's not a perfect stroke. So then I get some of that wood texture. I can of course make my brush thicker if I want the trunks to be thicker, but it works well with a finer brush. Try some other colors so you can see. So if you're just putting little sticks in the background and things like that, it works really well for that. Foliage Down is a great foliage brush. The foliage doesn't necessarily have to point down, but if you tilt your pen, then you can make it do that. Now, if you have a pen that supports rotation, this will be much easier. I'm using the Wacom Art pen, and I can just rotate the barrel of the pen. That way the foliage can point down without me having to hold my hand at an awkward angle. And again, I can put highlights on this, flip my pen the other way, and have foliage that's pointed up. Add a few more highlights on there. Let's take a look at Grass Knife next. Just pull up these grass blades using varied pen pressure. I get a really nice grass effect. I can also pull down like this if I want the blades to look different. I can add in other colors, and they blend in nicely. Here's another type of grass you can create if you want to create a lot of grass at once. Go ahead and just put in something like this, and I can go over it with a brighter color. And I can put in a lot of grass at once. And then if I need to, I can use the grass knife to go over that and just add some emphasis to it. That way most of the grass is already done. Here's another foliage brush called Leafy. This gives me very distinct leaves. Maybe they look kind of like oak leaves or something. I can put them in like this, get a different color, put some on top. Let's try it with a green so you can see it with that color. And again, mixing the colors together just helps give it more depth and dimension. Here's a very textured brush called Rocky. We want to use the paint and blend mode for this. You can see I get this additive and subtractive paint where I can make it look very rocky and thick. Add in some other colors here, and it just gives me a very organic effect. And last in this category is Sharp Leaves. This is another brush that I can rotate with the Wacom Art pen. I get these very, very thick clumps of leaves. So if I want to build up trees like this, I can do that. Select a lighter color, and I can build up highlights like so using lighter pressure. Next, we'll explore the oily category. First is Abrasive Oily. I'll lay down some paint with this brush, and if I go over it with light pressure, you can see that it sort of erodes the paint, and you get sort of a scumbling effect. I'll add some white paint into that, and then light pressure to create the scumbling. Next is a brush called Feathers. If I use light pressure with this, you can see I create this sort of feathered texture, and it goes whichever direction my brush is going. So if I were painting a bird or something, I could very easily put feathers on it. Heavy pressure will give you thicker, darker feathers. And then of course you can layer this up to get more dimension. Next we'll take a look at multi-stroke oils. As the name implies, you can create multiple strokes at once. So if you're going for sort of an impressionist painting, you can very easily put in a lot of strokes. There's also multi-stroke oils thin, which gives you thinner strokes. Let's move on to chunky oily. This is an oily brush that's very chunky. If I add some other colors into it, here you can see it has a lot of depth and character. And then I can blend and smudge with lighter pressure. Let's try flat thin bristle. This brush gives me a nice bristly effect. If I use lighter pressure, then I get a thinner paint. If I use heavier pressure, then I get a thicker paint. So if I were painting something like hair, this brush would work well for that. Here's rough oily pastel. This gives me a nice oil pastel effect. If I use lighter pressure, I can blend and smudge. And then heavier pressure gives me this really textured oily pastel. Splatter oily is up next. This creates splatters. I can dab with it, or I can paint strokes. And I get these really nice oily splatters. I'll add some other colors into it here. If you use lighter pressure, then you can blend it a bit and soften it up. Here's thick fractal. This gives me these broken textures that are in sort of a fractal pattern. And I can add other colors into that and use light pressure to kind of blend and smudge it together. And last in this category is thick oily. This gives me very thick paint. And again, I can blend it using lighter pressure to thin it out. Or if I want it to build up really thick, then I use firm pressure. Let's take a look at the brushes in the inking category. First is feather pen. If I draw with this brush using light pressure, then I just get sort of a solid line. But as I increase my pressure, the stroke starts to spread apart into 3 different strokes. So I can create these really nice feather effects for stylistic leaves and whatever you like. Here's hatching. Hatching follows the direction that my brush is tilted or rotated. So if I turn it this way, I get hatching that faces this direction. If I point it up, then I get vertical hatching. I can even make cross hatching like this. It's really quick and easy to create hatching with this brush. Here's a brush called Ink Bristles. And as you can see, I get this really nice inky effect, but it's as if I'm using a bristle brush. It's very, very random. This brush is excellent for painting hair. Let's take a look at ink splats. I can dab with this brush to create splats of ink. Because some of these brushes are actually in the inks category, we can also add water if you really want to wet them down. If you look closely, you can see the ink kind of bleeds and merges together. Add some other colors into that. And you can see it also builds up darker like ink would. And last in this category is stretched ink. As you can see, I get these ink blobs that are sort of stretched out directionally. This might work well for creating splashing waves and things like that. And last, we have the watercolor category. Let's start with wet pattern. If I paint with this brush, I get this interesting textured pattern. Light pressure will give me something like this. Heavier pressure will give me something like that that's more inverted. And if we let that diffuse, then we get some really interesting patterns. Paint another color into it here so you can see how it blends together. Let's try Grainy Wet next. This is a grainy brush that has a lot of little chunks of pigment in it. I can use lighter pressure to sort of fade it out as if I'm adding more water, and heavier pressure builds it up. And of course, if we let that diffuse, then some of that grain starts to merge together and become softer. Let's take a look at cracked splat. I get this nice textured fractal pattern, and if we let the paint diffuse, it starts to merge together. Here's fine splatter. This gives me these little splatters of watercolor paint. And again, if I let them diffuse, then they start to become more watercolor looking with fringe. Here's Fractal Splat. This is another splatter type brush. It builds up darker as I overlap the strokes. And if I use lighter pressure, then I can sort of fade it out. I'll let it diffuse and you can see how it looks. This might be a good one for creating foliage since it has sort of a leafy look to it. Fractal Wet is next. This is purely a blender brush, so I just use it on pre-existing paint, and I can blend up the edges and maintain that fractal effect. Let's take a look at soft dribble. I'll just paint some vertical strokes, and you can see I get this dribbly paint, as if my brush is just dripping paint on the canvas. You can use lighter pressure to get thinner, smaller dribbles, or heavier pressure to get bigger, broader dribbles. Let's give stretched drip a try. This has little drips that are stretched. They can go vertically or horizontally or any direction you like. If I build them up like this, then the color builds up darker. Here's a wet dabber. As the name implies, we can dab with this brush to get some really nice wet dabs that will diffuse. Add some other colors into that so you can see. And of course the colors will build up darker if I overlap them. And last in the watercolor category is wet to drip. This brush does not add any paint, and what we'll need to do is we will need to add some tilt, paint over the watercolor that's already on the canvas, and that plain water will create drips. And you can control the strength of the drips and the direction of the tilt as well. So if you want the drips to be weaker, then you just use less water. There you go, that was a demonstration of the brushes I created for Rebelle 7. Again, you can download these from my website at aaronrutten.com.